And now I'm going to try to share the screen. Except that I'm going to have to, 1 second, I'm going to have to, oh, I'm going to have to do this again. Hold on 1 second.
Not going anywhere.
Okay. Now let's try it again. Here we go. Okay, so here's the, 1 second. Hey, I want to not see the thumbnails. What can we do? All right. This is not letting me do what I want to do. One more second.
Isn't it the sidebar? Oh, I see. I should talk. I'm not tech savvy, so.
All right, this is the best right now I can do. For some reason, I can't get rid of my thumbnails. Do you see the thumbnails also?
Yeah, the page is on the side.
Right, so I want to get rid of that, and I'm not being able to get rid of it. Oh, yeah.
Yep,
Okay, good.
you got rid of it.
I did.
It was
So
the side.
now-
It was the sidebar.
It was the sidebar, you were right. But now I wanted to move over here, and it's not letting me do that. All right. So this is the story that we're going to look at today. It's called The Fast. It's by Edna Ferber. So Edna Ferber, a good all-American and Jewish author. Hold on a second. Ay. Okay, let's try it again. And this is a story written a long time ago. And it's about growing up in America. So let's see what happens. Good old America. Who'd like to read for us? I'm going to see if I can get this a little bigger. And there. All right, that's better.
Definitely.
Okay. Somebody want to volunteer to read, please?
I'll read if nobody else wants to, but I do read frequently. So if somebody else wants to read, I'll defer to them.
Anybody want to take the burden off of Carol for this time?
Well, not hearing everybody yelling at what is.
Okay, nice and slow, Carol.
Okay.
Slow.
Most families must be described against the background of their homes, but the Brandeis family, life was bounded and controlled by the store. Their meals and sleeping hours and amusements were regulated by it. It taught them much and brought them much and lost them much. Fanny Brandeis always said she hated it, but it made her wise and tolerant, and in the end, famous. I don't know what more one could ask of any institution. It brought her in contact with men and women, taught her how to deal with them. After school, she used often to run down to the store to see her mother, while Theodore went home to practice. Perched on a high stool in some corner, she heard and saw and absorbed. It was a great school for the sensitive, highly organized, dramatic little Jewish girl, for, to paraphrase a well-known stage line, there are just as many kinds of people in Winnebago as there are in Washington. It was this It was about this time that Fanny Brandeis began to realize actively that she was different. Of course, other little Winnebago girls' mothers did not work like a man in a store. And she and Bella Weinberg were the only two in her room at school who stayed out on the Day of Atonement and on New Year and the lesser Jewish holidays. Also, she went to temple on Friday night and Saturday morning, when the other girls she knew went to church on Sunday. These things set her apart in the little middle Western town. But it was not these that constituted the real difference. She played and slept and ate and studied like the other healthy little animals of her age. The real difference was temperamental or emotional or dramatic or historic or all four. They would be playing tag, perhaps in one of the cool green ravines that were the beauty spots of this little Wisconsin town. They nestled like exquisite emeralds in the embrace of the hills. Those ravines and Winnebago's civic surge had not yet swept them away in the deluge of old tin cans, ashes, dirt, and refuge, to be sold later for building lots. The Indians had camped and hunted in them. The one under the Court Street Bridge near the Catholic Church and monastery was the favorite for play. It lay a lovely, gracious thing below the hot little town, all green and lush and cool, a tiny stream dimpling through it.
Got it?
Got it. The plump Capuchin fathers in their coarse brown robes nodded about the waist with a cord. Their bare feet, thrust into sandals, would come out and sun themselves on the stone bench at the side of the monastery on the hill, or would potter about the garden. And suddenly Fanny would stop quite still in the midst of her tag game, struck with the beauty of the picture it called from the past. Little Oriental that she was able to combine the dry text of her history book with the green of the trees, the gray of the church, and the brown of the monks' robes, and evolve a thrilling mental picture therefrom. The tag game and her noisy little companions vanished. She was peopling the place with stealthy Indians, stealthy, cunning, yet savagely brave. They bore no relation to the object. Contemptible and rather smelly, Oneontas who came to the back door on summer mornings in calico and ragged overalls with baskets of huckleberries on their arm, their pride gone, a broken and conquered people. She saw them wild, free, sovereign, and there was no greasy, berry-peddling Oneontas among them. They were Sioux and Potawatomis. The last had a real Indian sound, and Winnebagos and Menominee and Outagamis. She made them taciturn and beady-eyed and lithe and fleet and every other adjectival
Adjectival.
Whatever thing. Her imagination and history book could supply. Thank you. The fat and placid Capuchin fathers on the hill became Jesuits, sinister, silent, powerful, with France and the Church of Rome behind them. From the shelter of that big oak would step Nicolette, the brave, first among Wisconsin explorers, and last to receive the credit for his hardihood. Jean Nicolette, she loved the sound of it. And with him was LaSalle, straight and slim and elegant, and surely wearing ruffles and plumes and sword even in a canoe. The Tanti, his Italian friend and fellow adventurer. Tanti of the satins and velvets, graceful, tactful, poised, a shadowy figure, his menacing iron hand, so feared by the ignorant savages, encased always in a glove. Surely a perfumed slap, a rude shove that jerked her head back sharply and sent her forward, stumbling and jarred like a fall. Yeah, tag, you're it. Fanny's it. Indians, priests, cavaliers, courtiers de bois, all vanished. Fanny would stand a moment, blinking stupidly. The next moment, she was running as fleetly as the best of the boys in savage pursuit of one of her companions in the tag game. She was a strange mixture of tomboy and bookworm, which was a mercifully kind arrangement for both body and mind. The spiritual side of her was groping and staggering and feeling its way about as does that of any girl whose mind is exceptionally active and whose mother is unusually busy. It was the Day of Atonement, known in the Hebrew.
It was on
the Day of Atonement, known in the Hebrew as Yom Kippur, in the year following her father's death, that side of her performed a rather interesting handspring. Fanny Brandeis had never been allowed to fast on this, the greatest and most solemn of Jewish holy days. Molly Brandeis's modern side refused to countenance the practice of withholding food from any child for 24 hours. So it was in the face of disapproval that Fanny, making deep inroads into the steak and fried potatoes at supper on the eve of the Day of Atonement, announced her intention of fasting from that meal to supper on the following evening. She had just passed her plate for a third helping of potatoes. Theodore, one lap behind her in the race, had entered his objection. Well, for the land's sake, he protested, I guess you're not the only one who likes sweet potatoes. Fanny applied a generous dab of butter to an already buttery morsel and chewed it with an air of conscious virtue. I've got to eat a lot. This is the last bite I'll have until tomorrow night. What's that? Exclaimed Mrs. Brandeis sharply. Yes, it is, hooted Theodore. Fanny went on conscientiously eating as she explained. Bella Weinberg and I are going to fast all day. We want to see if we can. Bet you can't, Theodore said. Mrs. Brandeis regarded her small daughter with a thoughtful gaze. But that isn't the object of fasting, Fanny, just to see if you can. If you're going to think of food all day through Yom Kippur services, I shan't, protested Fanny passionately. Theodore would, but I won't. Wouldn't any such thing denied Theodore. But if I'm going to play a violin solo during the memorial service, I guess I've got to eat my regular meals. Theodore sometimes played at temple on special occasions. The little congregation, listening to the throbbing rise and fall of the 15-year-old's violin playing, realized vaguely that there was something disturbingly, harrowingly beautiful. They did not know that they were listening to genius. Molly Brandeis, in her second best dress, walked to temple, Yom Kippur Eve, her son on her right side, her daughter on her left. She had made up her mind that she would not let this next day, with its poignant, beautiful service, move her too deeply. It was the first since her husband's death, and Rabbi Thalman rather prided himself on his rendition of the memorial service that came at 3 p.m. A man of learning, of sweetness, and of gentle wit was Rabbi Thalman, and unappreciated by his congregation. He stuck to the scriptures for his text, finding Moses a greater leader than Roosevelt, and the miracle of the burning bush more wonderful than the marvels of the 20th century wizardry of electricity. A little man, Rabbi Thalman, with hands and feet as small and delicate as those of a woman. Fanny found him fascinating to look on, in his rabbinical black broadcloth and his 2 pairs of glasses perched in reading upon his small hooked nose. He stood very straight in the pulpit, but on the street you saw that his back was bent just the least bit in the world. Or perhaps it was only his student stoop, as he walked along with his eyes on the ground, smoking those slender, dappled, pale brown cigars that looked as if they had been expressly cut and rolled to fit him. The evening service was at 7. The congregation, rustling in silks, was approaching the little temple from all directions. Inside, there was a low-toned buzz of conversation. The Brandeis' seat was well toward the rear, as befitted a less prosperous member of the rich little congregation. This enabled them to get a complete picture of the room in its holiday splendor. Fanny drank it in eagerly, her dark eyes soft and luminous. The bare, yellow varnished wooden pews glowed with the reflection from the chandeliers. The 7-branched candlesticks on either side of the pulpit were entwined with smilax. The red, what?
Smilax.
Slimax.
Smilax.
Smilax.
Yeah, it's a vine. I looked it up.
Better you than I wouldn't know what it is.
I didn't know either. I had to look. I looked it up.
The red plush curtain that hung in front of the ark on ordinary days and the red plush pulpit cover too were replaced by gleaming white satin edged with gold fringe and finished at the corners with heavy gold tassels. How the rich white satin glistened in the light of the electric candles. Fanny Brandeis loved the lights and the gleam and the music so majestic and solemn, and the sight of the little rabbi sitting so straight and serious in his high-backed chair, or standing to read from the great Bible. There came to this emotional little Jewess a thrill that was not born of religious fervor at all, I am afraid. The sheer drama of the thing got her. In fact, the thing she had set herself to do today had it very little of religion. Mrs. Brandeis had been right about that. It was a test of endurance, as planned. Fanny had never fasted in her healthy life. She would come home from school to eat formidable stacks of bread and butter, enhanced by brown sugar or grape jelly, and topped off with 3 or 4 apples from the barrel in the cellar. 2 hours later, she would attack a supper of fried potatoes and liver and tea and peach preserve and more stacks of bread and butter. Then there were the cherry trees in the backyard and the berry bushes, not to speak of sundry bags of small, hard candies of jelly bean variety, fitted for quick and secret munching during school. She liked good things to eat, this dirty little girl, as did her friend, the blonde and creamy person, Bella Weinberg. The 2 girls exchanged meaningful glances during the evening service. The Weinbergs, as befitted their station, sat in the 3rd row at the right, and Bella had to turn around to convey her silent messages to Fanny. The evening service was brief, even to the sermon. Rabbi Thalman and his congregation would need their strength for tomorrow's trial. The Brandeises walked home through the soft September night, and the children had to use all their Yom Kippur dignity to keep from scuffing through the piled up drifts of crackling autumn leaves. Theodore went to the cellar and got an apple, which he ate with what Fanny considered an unnecessary amount of scrunching. It was a firm, juicy apple, and it gave forth a crackling sound when its teeth met in its white meat. Fanny, after regarding him with a gloomy superiority, went to bed. She had willed to sleep late for gastronomical reasons, but the mental command disobeyed itself, and she woke early with a heavy feeling. Early as it was, Molly Brandeis had tiptoed in still earlier to look at her strange little daughter. She sometimes did that on Saturday mornings when she left early for the store and Fanny slept late. This morning, Fanny's black hair was spread over the pillow as she lay on her back, one arm outflung, the other at her breast. She made a rather startling black and white and scarlet picture as she lay there asleep. Fanny did things very much in the way too, with broad, vivid, unmistakable splashes of color. Mrs. Brandeis, looking at the black-haired, red-lipped child sleeping there, wondered just how much determination lay back of the broad white brow. She had said little to Fanny about this feat of fasting, and she told herself that she disapproved of it, but in her heart, she wanted the girl to see it through, once attempted. Fanny awoke at 7:30, and her nostrils dilated to the most exquisite, tantalizing, and fragrant of smells, the aroma of simmering coffee. It permeated the house. It tickled the senses. It carried with it the visions of hot, brown breakfast rolls and eggs and butter. Fanny loved her breakfast. She turned over now and decided to sleep again. But she could not. She got up and dressed slowly and carefully. There was no one to hurry her this morning with the call from the foot of the stairs of Fanny, your egg will get cold. She put on clean, crisp underwear and did her hair expertly. She slipped on an all-enveloping pinafore over her head that the new silk dress might not be crushed before church time. She thought that Theodore would surely have finished his breakfast by this time. But when she came downstairs, he was at the table. Not only that, he had just begun his breakfast. An egg, all golden and white and crispy brown at the frilly edges, lay on his plate. Theodore always ate his egg in a mathematical sort of way. He swallowed the white hastily first because he disliked it, and Mrs. Brandeis insisted that he eat it. Then he would brood a moment over the yolk that lay unmarred and complete, like an amber jewel in the center of the plate. Then he would suddenly plunge his fork into the very heart of the jewel, and it would flow over his plate, mingling with the butter. And he would catch it deftly with the little mops of warm, crisp, buttery roll. Fanny passed the breakfast table just as Theodore plunged his fork into the egg yolk. She caught her breath sharply and closed her eyes. Then she turned and fled to the front porch and breathed deeply and windily of the heady September Wisconsin morning air. As she stood there with her stiff, short, black curls still damp and glistening in her best shoes and stockings, with the all-enveloping apron covering her sturdy little figure, the light of struggle and renunciation in her face, she typified something at once fine and earthy. But the real struggle was to come later. They went to temple at 10, Theodore with his beloved violin tucked carefully under his arm. Bella Weinberg was waiting at the steps. Did you? She asked eagerly. Of course not, replied Fanny disdainfully. Do you think I'd eat old breakfast when I said I was going to fast all day? Then, with sudden suspicion, did you? No, stoutly. And they entered and took their seats. It was fascinating to watch the other members of the congregation come in, the women rustling, the men subdued with the unaccustomed dignity of black on a weekday. One glance at the yellow pews was like reading a complete social and financial register. The seating arrangement of the temple was the Almanac de Gotha, the Congregation Emmanuel, old Ben Reitman, patriarch among the Jewish settlers of Winnebago who had come over an immigrant youth and who now own hundreds of rich farm acres besides houses, mills, and banks, kinged it from the front seat to the center section. He was a magnificent old man with a ruddy face and a fine head, with a shock of heavy iron gray hair, keen eyes undimmed by years, and a startling and unexpected dimple in one cheek that gave him a mysterious and boyish look.
Mischievous
and boyish look. Behind this dignity sat his sons and their wives, and his daughters and their husbands and their children, and so on, back to the Brandeis pew. Third from the last, behind which sat only a few obscure families branded as Russians, as only the German-born Jew can brand those whose misfortune it is to be born in that region rather than as Hinter Berlin.
Known as in
To
that
be
region known as Hinter Berlin.
that region known as Hinter Berlin. The morning flew by with its music,
Its responses,
its responses, its sermon in German, full of 4 and 5 syllable German words like, I'm not even going to try it. And during the sermon, Fanny sat and dreamed and watched the shadow on the window of the pine tree that stood close to the temple, and was vastly amused at the jaundiced look that the square of yellow window glass cast upon the face of the vain and overdressed Mrs. Nathan Perilous. From time to time, Bella would turn to bestow upon her a look intended to convey intense suffering and a resolute though dying condition. Fanny stonily ignored these mute messages. They offended something in her, though she could not tell what. At the noon intermission, she did not go home to the tempting dinner smells, but wandered off through the little city and down to the river, where she sat on the bank and felt very virtuous and spiritual and hollow. She was back in her seat when the afternoon service begun. Some of the more devout members who remained to pray all through the midday. The congregation came straggling in by 2s and 3s. Many of the women had exchanged the severely corseted discomfort of the morning splendor for the comparative ease of second-best silks. Mrs. Brandeis, absent from her business throughout this holy day, came hurrying in at 2, a look with a rather anxious eye upon her pale and resolute little daughter. The memorial service was to begin shortly after 3 and lasted almost 2 hours. At 2:45, Bella slipped out through the side aisle, beckoning mysteriously and alluringly to Fanny as she went. Fanny looked at her mother. Run along, Mrs. Brandeis, said Mrs. Brandeis. Run along, said Mrs. Brandeis. The air will be good for you. Come back before the memorial service begins. Fanny and Bella met, giggling in the vestibule. Come on over to my house for a minute, Bella suggested. I want to show you something. The Weinberg house, a great, comfortable, well-built home with circling veranda and a well-cared-for lawn, was just a scant block away. They skipped across the street, down the block, and in at the back door. The big, sunny kitchen was deserted. The house seemed very quiet and hushed. Over it hung the delicious fragrance of freshly baked pastry. Bella, a rather baffled look in her eyes, led the way to the butler's pantry that was as large as the average kitchen, and there, arranged on platters and baking boards and on snowy white napkins, was that which made Tantalus' feast seem a dry and barren snack. The Weinbergs had baked. It is the custom in the household of atonement fasters of the old
fasters.
I'm sorry, of Atonement Day fasters of the old school to begin the evening meal after the 24 hours of abstainment with coffee and freshly baked coffee cake of every variety. It was a lead pipe blow at one's digestion, but delicious beyond imagining. Bella's mother was a famous cook, and her 2 maids followed in the ways of their mistress. There were to be sisters and brothers and out-of-town relations as guests at the evening meal, and Mrs. Weinberg had outdone herself. Oh, exclaimed Fanny in a sort of agony and delight. Take some, said Bella, the temptress. The pantry was fragrant as a garden with spices and fruit scents and the melting, delectable perfume of brown, freshly baked dough, sugar-coated. There was one giant platter devoted wholly to round, plump cakes with puffy edges in the center of a sunken pool that was all plum.
In the center of each,
a sunken pool that was all plum bearing on its bosom of snowy sifted sugar. There were others whose centers were apricot, pure molten gold in the sunlight. There were speckled expanses of cheese cushion, the golden browns
Kuchen.
cooking. Where was it? Cooking. Thank you. The golden surface showing rich cracks through which one caught glimpses of the lemon yellow cheese beneath cottage cheese that had been beaten up with eggs and spices and sugar and lemon. Flaky crust rose jaggedly above the plateau. There were cakes with jelly and cinnamon cushion and cutting cakes with almond slices nestling side by side. And there was freshly baked bread, twisted loaf with poppy seed freckling its braid and its sides glistening with the butter that had been liberally swabbed on it before it had been thrust into the oven. Fanny Brandeis gazed, hypnotized, and as she gazed, Bella selected a plum tart and bit into it, bit generously, so that her white little teeth met in the very middle of the oozing red-brown juice she had once heard.
And one heard.
Little squirt as they closed on the luscious fruit. At the sound, Fanny quivered all through her plump and starved little body. Have one, Bella, said Bella generously. Go on, nobody'll ever know. Anyway, we've fasted long enough for our age. I could fast till supper till I wanted to, but I don't want to. She swallowed the last morsel of the plum tart and selected another, apricot this time, and opened her moist red lips. But just before she bit into it, the Inquisition could have used Bella's talents. She selected its counterpart and held it out to Fanny. Fanny shook her head slightly. Her hand came up involuntarily. Her eyes were fastened on Bella's face. Go on, urged Bella. Take it. They're grand. The first bite of apricot vanished between her rows of sharp white teeth. Fanny shut her eyes as if in pain. She was fighting the great fight of her life. She was to meet other temptations and perhaps more glittering ones in her lifetime. But to her dying day, she never forgot that the first battle between the flesh and the spirit.
Never forgot that first battle.
But to her dying day, she never forgot that first battle between the flesh and the spirit. There in the sugar-scented pantry, and the spirit won. As Bella's lips closed upon the second bite of apricot tart, while her eye roved over the almond cakes, and her hand still held the sweet out to Fanny, the young lady turned sharply, like a soldier, and marched blindly out of the house, down the back steps, across the street, and so into the temple. The evening lights had just been turned on. The little congregation relaxed, weary, weak from hunger. Many of them sat rapt and still, except for those times when the prayer book demanded spoken responses. The voice of the little rabbi, rather weak now, had in it a timbre that made it startling, sweet, and clear and resonant. Fanny slid very quietly into the seat beside Mrs. Brandeis and slipped her moist and cold little hand into her mother's warm, hand-roughened palm. The mother's brown eyes, very bright with unshed tears, left their perusal of the prayer book to dwell upon the white little face that was smiling rather wanly up at her. The pages of the prayer book lay two-thirds or more to the left. Just as Fanny remarked this, there was a little moment of hush in the march of the day's long service. The memorial hour had begun. Little Dr. Thalman cleared his throat. The congregation stirred a bit, changed its cramped position. Bella, the guilty, came stealing in, a pink and gold picture of angelic virtue. Fanny, looking at her, felt very aloof and clean and remote. Mrs. Brandeis seemed to sense what had happened. But did you? But you didn't, did you? She whispered softly. Fanny shook her head. Rabbi Thalman was seated in his great carved chair. His eyes were closed. The wheezy little organ in the choir loft at the rear of the temple began the opening bars of Schumann's
Shomrei.
And then above the cracked voice of the organ rose the clear, pointed wail of a violin. Theodore Brandeis had begun to play. You know the playing of the average boy of 15, the nerve-destroying, uninspiring scraping. There was nothing of this in the sounds that this boy called forth from the little wooden box and the stick with its taut lines of catgut. Whatever it was, the length of the thin, sensitive fingers, the turn of the wrist, the articulation of the forearm, the something in the brain, or all these combined, Theodore Brandeis possessed that which makes for greatness. You realize that as he crouched over his violin to get his cello tones. As he played today, the little congregation sat very still, and each was thinking of his ambitions and his failures, of the lover lost, of the duty left undone, of the hope deferred, of the wrong that was never righted, of the lost one whose memory spells remorse. It felt the salt taste on its lips. It put up a furtive, shamed hand to dab at its cheeks and saw that the one who sat in the pew just ahead was doing likewise. This was what happened when the boy of 15 wetted his bow to his violin, and he who makes us feel all that, and he who makes us feel all this has that indefinable, magic, glorious thing known as genius. When it was over, there swept through the room that sigh following tension relieved. Rabbi Thalman passed a hand over his tired eyes, like one returning from a far mental journey, then rose and came forward to the pulpit. He began in Hebrew, the opening words of the memorial service, and so on to the prayers in English, with their words of infinite humility and wisdom. Thou hast implanted in us the capacity for sin, but not sin itself. Fanny stirred. She had learned that a brief half hour ago.
She had learned that
a brief half hour ago. The service marched on, a moving and harrowing thing. The amens rolled out with a new fervor from the listeners. There seemed nothing comic now in the way old Ben Reitman, with his slower eyes, always came out 5 words behind the rest, who tumbled upon the responses and scurried briskly through them, so that his fine old voice, somewhat hoarse and quavering, now rolled out its amen in solitary majesty. They came to that gem of humility, the mourner's prayer, the ancient and ever solemn Kaddish prayer. There is nothing in the written language that, for sheer drama and magnificence, can equal it as it is chanted in the Hebrew. As Rabbi Thalman began to intone it in its monotonous repetition of praise, there arose certain black-robed figures from their places and stood with heads bowed over their prayer books. These were members of the congregation from whom death had taken a toll during the past year. Fanny rose with her mother and Theodore, and who had left the choir loft to join them. The little wheezy organ played very softly. The black-robed figures swayed. Here and there, a half-stifled sob rose and was crushed. Fanny felt a hot haze that blurred her vision. She winked it away, and another burned in its place. Her shoulders shook with a sob. She felt her mother's hand close over her own that held one side of the book. The prayer that was not of mourning but of praise ended with a final crescendo from the organ. The silent silent black robed figures were seated. Over the little spent congregation hung a glorious atmosphere of detachment. These Jews, listening to the words that had come from the lips of the prophets in Israel, had been, on this day, thrown back thousands of years to the time when the destruction of the temple was as real as the shattered spires and dome of the cathedral at Rheims. Old Ben Reitman, faint with fasting, was far removed from his everyday thoughts of his horses, his lumber mills, his farms, his mortgages. Even Mrs. Nathan Perlis, in her black satin and bugles and jets, her cold, hard face, unusually unlightened by sympathy or love, seemed to feel something of this emotional wave. Fanny Brandeis was shaken by it. Her head ached. Was that hunger? And her hands were icy. The little Russian girl in the seat just behind them had ceased to wriggle and squirm and slept against her mother's side. Rabbi Thalman, there on the platform, seemed somehow very far away and vague. The scent of clove apples and ammonia salts filled the air. The atmosphere seemed strangely wavering and luminous. The white satin of the ark curtain gleamed and shifted. The long service swept on to its close. Suddenly, organ and choir burst into a paean. Little Dr. Thalman raised his arms. The congregation swept to its feet with a mighty surge. Fanny rose with them, her face very white in its frame of black curls, her eyes luminous. She raised her face for the words of the ancient benediction that rolled in its simple simplicity and grandeur from the lips of the rabbi. May the blessing of the Lord our God rest upon you all. May God bless thee and keep thee. May God cause his countenance to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. May God lift up his countenance unto thee and grant thee peace. The Day of Atonement had come to an end. It was a very quiet, subdued and spent little flock that dispersed to their homes. Fanny walked out with scarcely a thought of Bella. She felt vaguely that she and this school friend were formed of different stuff. She knew that the bond between them had been the grubby, physical one of childhood, and that they never would come together in the finer relation of the spirit, though she could not have put this new knowledge into words. Molly Brandeis put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Tired, Franken? A little. Bet you are hungry from theater. I was, but I'm not now. Wait. Noodle soup and chicken. She had intended to tell of the trial in the Weinberg's pantry, but now something within her, something fine, born of this day, kept her from it. But Molly Brandeis, to whom 2 and 2 often made 5, guessed something of what had happened. She had felt a great surge of pride. Had Molly Brandeis, when her son had swayed the congregation with the magic of his music, she had kissed him goodnight with infinite tenderness and love. But she came into her daughter's tiny room after Fanny had gone to bed and leaned over and put a cool hand on her hot forehead. Do you feel all right, my darling? No, replied Fanny drowsily. Franken, doesn't it make you feel happy and clean to know that you were able to do the thing you started out to do? Only Molly Brandeis was thinking aloud now, quite forgetting that she was talking to a very little girl. Only life seems to take such special delight in offering temptation to those who are able to withstand it. I don't know why that's true, but it is. I hope, oh, my little girl, my baby, I hope. But Fanny never knew whether her mother finished that sentence or not. She remembered waiting for the end of it to learn what it was her mother hoped. She had felt a sudden scalding drop on her hand where her mother bent over. The next thing she knew, it was morning with mellow September sunshine.
All right, that's the deal.
Oh.
So here we are. Anybody want to say a word or two about how the story went for them?
I'm surprised she didn't write at the end. Did Fanny eat? Was she too worn out to even think about food? The author kind of skipped that scene.
Well,
No,
go ahead.
excuse me. I read it as that Fanny didn't eat. She went to bed. She wasn't interested.
Okay.
But I had one thought while I was reading it about how Theodore did the egg yolk. My grandfather would eat the white, and then he would take the yolk under his spoon and eat the whole yolk in one fell swoop, which is what I thought Theodore was going to do. Oh.
So what's this story all about?
Spirituality and what you get from fasting, and it's not an endurance contest. It's how you feel about it, and all the things that happen during Yom Kippur from Kol Nidre through the end.
What is even though she can't put it in words, at the end, the author says Fanny sort of senses that she and Bella are not made out of the same stuff. What was that all about?
I got that at the end. I got the feeling that their spirituality and how they think and how they do things is definitely different. And Fanny definitely saw a different side of Bella. Like I think she saw that. I think she felt that Bella thought it was an endurance contest, and it's not an endurance contest.
Well, Bella
it's how you feel.
Bella cheated. She said nobody will ever know. She went in secret to the area where all the goodies were. And so not only was she not honoring her commitment, but she was sneaky and she was lying.
I mean, when I was listening to the way the pantry was described, the writer Edna Ferber really goes to town on the description of those luscious, unbelievable pastries. Like, this is, glorious stuff. There's a kind of a quiet, restrained way. There's a little conversational part of the way that she writes about other things. Very matter of fact also. And then when she gets into this description, it's poetry. I mean, this is like, she was singing hallelujah to these cakes. That was, what was she trying to say by it? Why, what was she trying to say by that? It seems to me, that was what she was doing. She was celebrating. This is Bella's world, the other girl. It's delicious, it's gorgeous, it's fun, it's delightful, it's just good, and it's pleasurable, and it's all so wonderful. And why not? Why not enjoy it? And Fanny, why, if it's not about endurance, why not? Why does Fanny not eat it? It's not about endurance. Good. So we know what it's not about. Then what is it about?
Her spirituality. There was something about the service that got to her, and she was able to not give in to temptation. She had a I want to say a spiritual goal. It was something she wanted to do, and her reasons for doing it, I don't think Edna Ferber explained, but there was an inner self in her that she wanted to do it.
Yeah, remember, she made the decision before she got to the service. It wasn't that the service had the influence on her. So how did the description of the Yom Kippur service feel from your experiences?
It's with the organ and the violin, it took me back to my growing up Reform. But and the thing about the memorial service at 3 p.m.
Right. This is definitely a German. She points that out, right? This is a German Jewish community. They look down on the Eastern Europeans, and this is very, very influenced by Reform. Although, of course, our, musical introduction to Kol Nidre has a lot of the same feel as what was described in this. We have in our shul, that element that we also want to bring into the service. So there's certain kinds of things about it that obviously are different, but there are also, certain commonalities.
Rabbi,
So, yeah.
this is Meryl.
Mhm.
I saw this whole story a little bit as a coming of age story of starting to grow up and showing more respect for the traditions of the religion or her world and her parents, and the other girl was just behind her. She wasn't maybe as mature, and Fanny thought, oh, well, we'll never be friends again. But, maybe in 5 or 6 years when they're both kind of like 17, they may be on the same page. But I just saw it as partly a coming of age and maturing in a way. And her friend was just behind her.
Right. Now, we don't want to pile on too heavy on the friend. We don't want to be too negative. The friend is a very fine person. But the point, and I think you're right, it's definitely about coming of age and wanting to be that more serious person. But of course, in the end, she's a kid who just simply falls asleep at the end and misses the last sentence that her mom was going to say while she feels the hot tears that her mother is shedding on her hand. But on the other hand, there's something about focusing on this young woman or just this person who's growing up, this Fanny, with a statement all the way at the beginning. Remember, all the way at the beginning, she's introduced as somebody who's different. She's different than other people. And some of it has to do with the fact that she's a Jew in a broader context, a community that's where the Jews are a small congregation. That phrase, small congregation is brought up again and again and again. But it's something else, she says. The Edna Ferber's, there's something else. There's some quality about her, which is a little different. And there's two places at the beginning and at the end. It's like a bookends. At the beginning, at the end of the story, there are these kind of historical scenes that come up from the past. Remember, in the beginning, she's playing tag with her friends, and she gets out into the landscape there, and basically she sort of like loses track of her friends and the game, and she goes off into a reverie. She goes off into her own imagination. And what does she imagine? Do you remember? She imagines this whole American scene with the indigenous peoples, the different Indian tribes, and the missionaries and the Jesuits coming, and she gives those tribe people more dignity. The people that she knows now have been defeated and broken, but she imagines a historical time when they were fierce and courageous. And then at the end of the story, what does she think about, or what does our author conjure up for us? I'm gonna see if I can bring it up there again. Whoops. Yeah. So here we are. Over here. Carol, you want to do us the favor? Read it one more time. From Over the Little Spent Congregation.
All right. Over the little spent congregation hung a glorious atmosphere of detachment. These Jews, listening to the words that had come from the lips of the prophets in Israel, had been, on this day, thrown back thousands of years to the time when the destruction of the temple was as real as the shattered spires and dome of the cathedral at Rheims. Old Ben Reitman, faint with fasting, was far removed from his everyday thoughts of his horses, his lumber mills, his farms, his mortgages. Even Mrs. Nathan Perols, in her black satin and bugles and jets, Her cold, hard face, usually unlightened by sympathy or love, seemed to feel something of this emotional wave. Fanny Brandeis was shaken by it.
Right.
Her
Thank you.
headache.
That's good, good, good. That's good, that's good. I want to, yeah. Where's my thing here? Here it is. So, so what's the historical place that we're brought to? And there's something else about it also. You know, Fanny is very moved by a different kind of historical remembrance. It's ancient Jewish history. It's the history of the Jewish people. And here she shares that experience with everybody else who's at least awake, except for that little Russian girl who fell asleep. But she's touched by this whole pageantry along with a community. So there's this also this kind of like, she's got a very vivid sense of imagination and she's sensitive and so on. And obviously the family's got it in their genes. Her brother is a genius violinist. But there's something about the Jewish people's experience that means something to her, and that calls on her in a way that maybe her friend Bella will is not either ready for or won't hear it. And it's not so clear that Theodore hears it. He's a great musician, but whether or not this is something that he thinks means something in terms of his being a Jew is not, it's I'm not condemning him. I'm just saying it's not this focus. It's not this very serious call on his soul. So it's not just spirituality in a kind of a abstract way. It's a sense of what connection and what is important and who is important and why, that this Fanny is trying to embrace. Fanny, the name Fanny was Edna Ferber had an older sister, Fanny. So whether she's talking autobiographically or whether she's really portraying something about her sister, I don't know, but she uses Fanny as the name of this main character. Anybody else have any other comments before we close up shop?
Yeah, just a quick one from Merrill. I'm probably reading into this, and it's not the focus of what our discussion has been, but I think this was the first Yom Kippur since her father died.
Right.
So there's she has a different place in the family, and she's just thinking about life and everything differently than
that coming of age that we mentioned, certainly becomes much more important to her when her father is no longer there. Like she has to grow up. That's right.
Yeah.
It definitely puts a different context in it, because the first of everything after you lose a spouse or a parent or something, there's a different feel.
Right. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Hope to see you next time.
Thank you. Yashikoa.
Thank you.